Hello! It's good to see all of you. You know, I'm a visitor at this cemetery, just as you are. I was buried down in Oakland, but I grew up here in Fortuna. My name was Orpha Heath. Maybe some of you remember my father, Albert Heath, who worked here as a teamster? No? Oh, I suppose not. Sometimes I forget what a long time it's been. I was my parents' eldest child. You know, they say there's a difference between older and younger children, and I think that's true. I always knew that when I had a problem, I had to fix it myself. But youngest children, they grow up with so many people taking care of them that they never learn to take care of themselves. That was the problem with my husband, Charles Lawrence. He had two older brothers and an older sister, and I think they babied him so much that he never looked after himself. And I think he thought it would always be like that. And when I couldn't solve his problems, and he couldn't solve them himself, that's when everything fell apart. Charles and I married August 28th, 1898. He was a door maker for the Humboldt Milling Company in Fortuna. He made a good living, and we were happy for a while. Our children came quickly. Clark in 1899 and Audra in 1900. But our third baby, well, it was a hard labor, much harder than the other two. He only lived a few days. We were going to name him after my father. I talk about how different Charles and I were, but I suppose in one way we were the same. After our baby died, we started drinking. Now, we always had whiskey in the house for when Charles's friends would come over to visit, but after the baby died, we kept drinking every night, whether we had company or not. I saw soon enough that we couldn't go on like that. A man can't show up for work day after day drunk and expect to keep his job. One day, I took the bottle of whiskey and I poured it out on the ground, and I told him we weren't going to buy any more. And we didn't, for a while. When he was 10 years old, our son Clark got sick. It was consumption. I think you call it tuberculosis now. We went down to my sister's house in Oakland, thinking we could get better medical care for him down there. It didn't do any good. He died September 1st, 1912. He was just 12 years old. That's when we bought the whiskey again. Oh, we did stop drinking time and time again. Always because I decided we had to. But something always happened to start us up again. My brother Ray died when he was just 21 years old of consumption, just like our Clark. And then we got the news that my father was killed in southern Humboldt at Fort Seward. He had just started a new job building the Northwestern Pacific Railroad. He was moving his things into the cabin they assigned him, and some workers nearby decided to set off some dynamite to clear some rocks. Well, they used too much dynamite. The rocks rained down through the roof of the cabin and crushed my father's skull. Well, you can imagine how Charles and I dealt with that. But that time, a neighbor lady, a horrible, interfering old biddy, went to the probation office and told them that Charles and I weren't fit to take care of our daughter, Audrey. When it came time to go in front of the judge, Charles was falling down drunk. The judge gave him 4 months in jail for showing up like that. I begged and pleaded to the judge to give my daughter back. I swore I would reform if only he'd give her back. Well, she did come back, and I kept my promise for a while. I rented a cottage for Audrey and me, and I took in sewing jobs to keep us afloat. And I rented out a room to a boarder. But Charles wanted to move in with us again when he got out of jail. And I kept telling him, no, we weren't good for each other. If we stayed together, we would never stop drinking. That went on for a year or so, but Charles kept begging me to take him back. One night, he came over around 7 o'clock. Oh, I wish now I'd never let him in, but I did. I sat there doing my sewing and listening to the gramophone. Charles kept on pleading, saying the same thing over and over. It got late, and he didn't have anywhere to stay, so I told him he could stay over, but just for one night. When I went to bed, I could still hear him in the parlor, pacing up and down and up and down. I didn't know what he'd done until it was all over. About 3 o'clock in the morning, he went to the shed, got an axe, and beat in my skull with it. I remember it suddenly seemed as if I was standing by my bed looking down at my body with blood everywhere. Charles was sitting beside me sobbing with his head in his hands, saying if he couldn't have me, nobody would. It was Audrey who found us like that. I'm so sorry she had to see it. She was only 15 years old. I wonder if she ever got over it. Charles grabbed her by the arm and tried to kill her too, but she managed to break away, run through the house, and jump through a window to a neighbor lady's, who called the police and arrested Charles. I lingered around for a while to see what would happen. The police took Charles to the morgue. He kissed my face and he said, she was a good woman and I loved her, but she wouldn't come back to me, and I knew I couldn't live alone. I remember what Audrey said to him. In spite of everything, she took his hands and said, brace up, Papa, it's just us now. Charles spent 7 years in San Quentin. It does seem like it should have been longer. Audrey grew up to have her own family. I look in on them from time to time. All of that was such a long time ago. I think you can understand why I like to come back to Fortuna sometimes. The place I grew up where I was a child, before Charles, before the drinking, before all of it. But I shouldn't keep you any longer. You have a lot of people you need to meet. There's Mrs. Emma O'Connor, who ran the Lane House Hotel. I remember looking up to her when I was young. She was the kind of woman I wanted to be. John Marks. I remember the horrible landslide that killed him in the winter of 1903. And poor Annie Anson. I remember what a shock it was to all of us when she killed herself. Gus Stone gave up his life to save another, like the true brother of the Knights of Pythias that he was. Poor James Macaulay. He'd been married only 10 days when his life ended on that road outside of Phillipsville. And then there was Nathan Baldry. He was a contractor who built many of our schools and churches. Now he died because he was a typical man who wouldn't go to the doctor soon enough. But that all was a long, long time ago. So, go on. The others are waiting for you. And thanks for listening. It helps. It helps more than you can possibly know.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to take a photograph of all you fine folk. If you would just come to the middle here, and I'll focus you in and we'll get one picture taken. Oh, looks like everyone's doing well. And I'll put this in and very good, very good. Thank you very much. Deming and I, we just like to find new careers and new adventures. And oh, I must tell you who I am and who this fella Deming is. My name is Emma Harris O'Connor. I was born in 1858 in Grass Valley, California, where I lived and attended an all-girls school. My family lived in Blocksburg in Humboldt County, and that's where I met my very own entrepreneur, Deming O'Connor. 2 months after I turned 20, we married. Deming was 29. We had, oh, he was a fine, fine man. We had 39 wonderful years of marriage together, and he was just such fun. That in Blocksburg is where we started our photography business, or career. It became a career for me. My children, I was married to Denning for 39 years and bore him 5 children. When we lived in Blocksburg, at one day, my children always remember when the circus came to town, and they took elephants and came right through the center of town, and how my children loved that. I only wish I would have taken a picture of the whole thing. At one point in the late 1890s, we had 4 very harsh winters, and Deming and I decided to move to another place. We decided to move to Hydesville. Deming was a dentist and also a barber, so he left early to open his business, his offices with his business in, and I was left behind. I was left to pack up our horse-drawn wagon with all our worldly possessions, 4 children and a dog. Took me 4 days to get there. 4 long days to get to Hydesville. But he set up his practice and we stayed about a year. Then we started hearing stories about this up-and-coming town of Fortuna that was making its mark in the world, and they had great business there, so we decided to move to Fortuna. When we moved to Fortuna, we purchased the Lane House Hotel on Main Street, where Denning had his office, his dental office and his barber office, and he was very well known and very well liked by the children, and it was no wonder. He gave everybody a nickel for every tooth he pulled. A whole nickel for a tooth? Being a native Californian, I thought it was so important for me to belong to the native daughters of the Golden West. And when I come to Fortuna, on my ghostly strolls, I have to go through Roner Park. And when you enter Roner Park and you look to the left, there's a monument with my name engraved on it from the native daughters. And behind that monument, they planted a tree, which has now grown tall and proud. It just makes me feel good. It was easy in Fortuna to become involved in the town. Everyone was friendly and it was such a nice town. So I became involved and was a charter member of the Grandmother Club. I thoroughly enjoyed that because by this time I had 11 grandchildren and 16 great-grandchildren. What fun it was. I stayed their club secretary for 20 years. The Garden Club in Fortuna also piqued my interest, and I thought, you know, one day wouldn't it just be a nice just to come down Main Street in Fortuna and have flowers on all the corners at the intersection. I really enjoyed getting together yearly for our garden shows because it was where I could meet my old friends and we'd spend the days together. In 1911, a fire was started in the Fortuna Bakery. It threatened our hotel, the movie theater, some other businesses in the area. The Star Hotel was on fire several times, but due to the gallant work of the firefighters and the volunteers, our hotel was safe from destruction. We used our hotel to feed all the volunteers and the firefighters sandwiches and coffee, and they greatly appreciated it. We were so happy to be able to do that. We ended up having $500 worth of destruction to our hotel. And the sad thing is we only had $50 worth of insurance. But Denning and I decided to rethink this hotel business. We decided that maybe this was not for us. So we stayed there a year and then we sold. But Deming kept his office, his dental and barber office, in the hotel. And by this time, our son Wid was also a dentist with his father, so that was nice. But things changed. And in 1917, at the age of 68, I lost my precious Deming. I struggled, and I was on my own, and I was moving along, just getting along fine, actually, when I was going down Main Street one day, and this buffoon was driving, the people said, at a rate of speed of 35 miles an hour, and he hit me. I suffered my right leg broken in 2 places, fractured kneecap, and my face was was very bruised. Dr. Jorgensen of the Union Hospital in Eureka did the best job he could do at the time. I had extreme pain, some paralysis, and thank God I had this crutch, because this is what helped me get to all my meetings, and I was very grateful for this. Life was wonderful in Fortuna. I loved it. The friendliness of the folk there, the weather, the sun was always shining, and if it wasn't shining in one area, you just turn around and look in another area and it was shining. I hope it never goes away. Oh, I'm off to a meeting. Thank you.
Afternoon. My name is John Marks. They asked me to tell you about my life and about my sudden death in February of 1903. There's really not much to say about my life. I never married or had any children. I was born in New Brunswick, Canada in 1856. My twin brother, Joseph, and I came out to Humboldt County following our older brothers and a sister who settled in Eureka. I was a working man, a laborer all my life. And after 40 years of toil, my body was kind of worn down and broken. I mashed my hand between 2 logs working in the woods and never properly healed. I was lucky, though. My brother Joseph was blinded in an accident, and we had to find him a place down in a charity home in Oakland where he made brooms to earn his keep. I kept working up here, and mostly in the logging camps around Scotia. The good folks at Pacific Lumber Company kept me on despite my bad hand. Like in Noah's day, it kept raining and raining and raining. We had 20 inches of rain before New Year's. Then there was a little break in early January. There was no point in getting out to the woods. Water was gushing out of the hillsides, gathered into deep pools anywhere the ground was low, and of course the river was running high and dirt brown. They turned most of us loose, but they had me working in Scotia for a bit, sweeping walks. That was a nice break. Then it started raining again on January 18th. Just a little at first, but it really started coming down on Tuesday. They kind of run out of work for me in Scotia, so I headed up to Eureka to visit with my brother and sister. I wanted to see if they had any news about Joseph down south. Anyways, like I said, it started raining again really hard when I was in Eureka. The daily paper had accounts from all over the county about the damage and flooding that was happening to houses and roads and bridges. Most all commerce had come to a standstill. Trains couldn't run, ferries were tied up, ships couldn't load or unload their freight. There was something like 16 inches of rain in just a few days. I was happy to be sheltering with my family. The telegraph lines down to San Francisco were downed, and with the railroads closed and roads closed, we were cut off from the rest of the world. Well, the rain finally let up on Wednesday, January 28th. It got cold then, and on Friday we had a terrific hailstorm in Eureka. My brothers and I were walking home from the waterfront that night through the drifts of hailstones, and Arthur packed up a slushy ice ball and pelted William with it. Pretty soon the four of us were in full-pitched battle, just like we were boys playing in the snow back in New Brunswick. Well, next day we read about a terrible slide that had come across the tracks near Camp 5 in Scotia. I guess half a hillside's worth of mud had come down and was blocking the tracks. We read about some men who had died in their cabins. They were pretty much wiped off the face of the earth. The slide had come down in the middle of the night while they were sleeping, and they never knew what hit them. What a way to go, I thought. Sleeping peacefully in your bunk one minute, snuffed dead and torn up with no apprehension whatsoever of your impending doom. Well, I wanted to lend a hand with the slide, so on Monday morning I bid my family farewell and made my way by train and ferry and finally by foot to Camp 5. There was about 20 of us who walked in that day. It's funny, the sun was shining that day, and we were feeling so optimistic about the situation we figured we'd whip that slide out in no time. Of course, when we reached the slide, we realized how wrong we were. The mud stretched from the toe of the slope across the tracks all the way to the river. There were whole trees mixed in with it, splintered and broken like they were little twigs. The river itself was surging at the banks. There was about 100 yards of track covered by the mud, which rose to 20, 30, even 50 feet high in some places. The men were already working on the slide looked like tiny ants trying to remove a mud clod from their nest. Well, we commenced to work, and 4 days of hard toil later, we managed to make some progress. Shovelful by shovelful, we cleared the tracks. A steady procession of men with wheelbarrows had carted the mud off to the river, where Mother Nature lent a hand and carried it out to the sea. It was Friday morning, about 8 o'clock, I guess. I was standing with a couple other fellows. I don't remember their names. We were looking at the face of the slide, which still rose well over our heads. Something about it was making the back of my neck itch. The slide's face was leaking a thin, watery mud, a steady stream trickling away between our feet. Remember those guys in the cabin who'd been killed in their sleep with no idea what hit them? I can't decide if that may be the better way to go, because as I was looking at the slide face, I realized it was ripe to blow again. I turned to run, but the muddy torrent was on us in an instant. I had maybe 5 seconds of sheer terror and pain in the dark, roaring mud before it was all over. It seemed a lot longer. It was some weeks later before my body was found in the river, after the river had washed it out of the slide. It's funny how that big, rain-glutted river wanted to move everything, mud and wood and man alike, on down to the ocean. My brothers identified my corpse from my ring and watch. It was some weeks before they found my corpse floating in the river after it had washed out of the slide. It's funny how that big, rain-glutted river wanted to wash everything, wood and mud and man alike, on down to the ocean. My brothers identified my corpse, which was pretty beaten up, by my ring and my watch. I never did get to see my people in Eureka again, but at least they could come down here on a sunny day and visit with me. I hope my brother in Oakland didn't take the news too hard. Poor blind Joseph. They say a man realizes he's mortal when his own brother dies. Well, thanks for listening.
I hear they call this Sunrise Cemetery now. Guess somebody decided Sunrise sounds better than Newburgh. Maybe it sounds more hopeful. It's funny to me, because the way I see it, no place out here has any proper sunrise. I'm from the state of Maine, from Washington County, the easternmost point of these whole United States. They say that Washington County is the place where the sun rises. So that's what I think sunrise is supposed to look like. That great glowing orb rising up over the sea. Shafts of light through the pine trees on the islands. The whole ocean glowing silver and gold. My name's Adelia, although it says Amelia on my slab back there. Adelia Moore, until I married Aaron Morang. We'd known each other all our lives, but we didn't really get sweet on each other till he left for the war. Seemed that every young man in our town joined up to go crush the rebels. Us girls at home, we had plenty of extra work on the farms and helping out with the fishing boats with so many men away. But we still had time for dreaming. My friend Eliza and I, we made little shrines to hold the photographs of our sweethearts. We set them on pedestals and then glued seashells all around them till finally they looked like tiny shell pyramids with the portraits of the men we loved right on top. Aaron wrote to me when he was away. I treasured those letters, kept them in a box that I'd covered with more seashells until the day I died. In February of '64, the men who'd served since the start of the war, those who were still alive, came home on furlough. Aaron and I married March 15th, 1864. The next month, he reported back to his regiment. I was lucky. Both Aaron and my brother Alonzo came back at the end of the war. Now, before Aaron left, he'd worked in a sawmill, but things weren't looking so rosy for Maine's sawmills anymore. Most all the trees you could get to halfway easy were down by that time. A lot of folks we knew were coming out here to Humboldt County, where there was a whole different kind of trees. Redwoods, 25 feet in diameter, some of them growing up to 400 feet tall. Aaron and I came to Eureka in 1873, and he built us a sweet, pretty little cottage at the corner of 10th and G Streets. And he got a job at the Occidental Mill. That's where he died, too, in 1889. He slipped and fell in the log pond one day and hit his head on a chain and drowned before they could fish him back out. Aaron and I never had any children, none that lived, but my brother Alonzo had 4 and our sister Harriet had 15, so I suppose our family did its part to help found the next generation. I had a pension as Aaron's widow, and I took in sewing, so I had enough to get by. But my brother and sister kept writing to me, asking me to come live with them, and finally I did. Spent a couple of years with Aaron back in Maine, and then 1 year with Harriet and her husband and their passel of kids, as big a contrast as you can imagine, down in New Orleans, Louisiana. Well, it took only 1 summer there for me to realize I had to either go back to Maine or back to Humboldt County. Now, all the time I'd been away, an old friend was writing to me. John Williams was his name. He was a veteran of the war, just like Aaron. They were brother members of the Grand Army of the Republic post in Eureka. All the time I was away, John was writing to me, asking me to come back to Humboldt and marry him. And that summer, by the shore of Lake Pontchartrain, I decided that's just what I'd do. We were married in Eureka, July 8th, 1901. Came down here to Fortuna and leased the Fell place out on Sandy Prairie Road. Now, I ought to tell you about that horse. John had this horse. He called it Jack, his own nickname from when he was a child. He said it reminded him of his youthful high spirits. I called it Jack Ass. July 23rd, 1903, I hitched Jack Ass up to the buggy and went out to visit Jim Rowley out at his daughter and son-in-law's place out by Table Bluff. He was another old veteran, a friend of John's and of Aaron's from the GAR. John was going to come out with me that day, but he wasn't feeling well, so he decided to stay home. I spent a nice day visiting with Jim Rowley and his family, and about 5 o'clock I headed back in towards town. You know how the county road near Palmer Creek, how it runs right alongside the railroad tracks? Well, I was just driving over Palmer Creek Bridge when the afternoon train from Eureka was coming in. Maybe the train spooked Jackass. Maybe he decided it was time for a race. That stupid horse took off, and for a while it did almost keep up with the train. Then I saw looming up ahead, after about half a mile or so of this, there over alongside the road was one of the railroad lumber piles. Buggy hit the lumber pile, I was thrown. From what I heard later, landed right on my head and broke my neck. I kind of lingered around for a little while after that, curious, I guess, wanted to find out more about what had happened. They stopped the train and came back to pick up my body and take it into town. I heard the passengers and the conductor and the engineer all talking. The passengers had seen the predicament I was in. They were trying to warn the engineer, trying to notify him, get him to stop the train. But wouldn't you know it? The all-fired bell cord broke. By the time they got the message to the engineer, I'd already landed on my head. So there you have it, the story of my death, the sunset of my life, way out here in the land where the sun sets, which does make it kind of funny that somebody got the bright idea of naming this place Sunrise Cemetery.
Hello. I see I have visitors. It's nice to have visitors, I guess. My name is Annie G. Ensign, daughter of Herman and Julia Ensign. I wasn't born here in Fortuna, where I seem to be buried, just over there. No, I was born in Ferndale, California. Well, have you heard of it? It's just a few hours' ride, plus the ferry trip across the river. My little sisters are still buried there, last I checked. But our parents, they moved to Fortuna, so I suppose that's why I'm buried here. I didn't spend my whole life in Fortuna or in Ferndale. When I was 19, I moved to Glendale. You see, I have a melancholy disposition, or at least that's what people said about me. So, I guess my parents thought that a change in scenery would help me. I stayed with the Murphy family, Leela Murphy and her husband John, and their 4 children. Nice people. It's not their fault what happened to me, what I did. I was able to obtain the means to my end at the Shaw Ranch when Mrs. Murphy and I were there for a visit. Strychnine, They kept it on the ranch to kill varmints. I almost succeeded in fulfilling my desire, but I was stopped by the ever-vigilant Mrs. Murphy. I guess my parents asked her to keep an eye on me. Not to be undone, I managed to get a few moments alone later in the week. I walked into the Murphy's kitchen and swallowed the strychnine. It was 8:30 p.m. I remember seeing that on the clock on the kitchen wall. I swallowed the strychnine and then I wandered outside. I must not have been thinking straight. I forgot how far away from home I was. I had it in my mind that I could just walk home to my parents, but just a little ways from the house, I felt like I couldn't walk anymore, so I went and I laid down under a big tree. I remember laying there and looking up at the evening sky and thinking that maybe this is where they would bury me, just right there under that big tree. That's where Mrs. Murphy found me. She helped me up and helped me walk back to the house. From the way she was talking, I guess she thought I just fainted. I hid what I had done from her until we got back inside. But then I couldn't hide it anymore. That's when the convulsions started. I'll never forget the look on poor Leela Murphy's face when I told her about the strychnine. I regretted my decision then, but it was too late. I remember calling out for Mr. Murphy, "Hurry, hurry, please, catch a doctor." And he set out post-haste. Mrs. Murphy tried her best to keep me alive until he got back. I remember she walked into the kitchen and got the salt and made me drink a big glass of salt water. But it didn't do any good. I was dead a long time before Mr. Murphy got back with the doctor. The announcement for my death was printed in our newspaper right alongside the announcement for our county fair, so that's exciting, I guess. Well, It's something anyway. They said some nice things about me in the newspaper. The Humboldt Times said that I was of a prepossessing appearance and was favorite by all who knew me. And the Arcata Union said that I had a quiet disposition and ladylike manners. But I guess I didn't really live up to that then, did I? It's not very ladylike to swallow strychnine and then go lay down under a tree. My mother lived only a few years after my death, and she's buried right beside me. I still feel sorry about what I did, how my death must have hurt her, but I guess I wasn't really thinking about that then, was I? The coroner attributed my death to melancholia. He wrote that she was of a melancholy disposition, and it is to that temperament alone that her death could be attributed, for no other cause is known. If the cause of my death was anything more menacing or intriguing or even all that interesting, you'll never know because I took it here with me to my grave.
Oh, it's so good to see you all. Thank you all for coming. Please, as you gather around, take a moment to meet your neighbors. Smile, wave, shake hands, introduce yourselves. You see, these people are your brothers and sisters. They're just like you and me, and they have their own trials and tribulations and joys, so please, be kind to them. And be kind, and let them be kind to you in turn. We could all use a little more kindness of thy neighbor. You see, I belong to a fraternal order known as the Knights of Pythias. Founded in 1864 in Washington, D.C., it's the first ever to receive a charter as an act of Congress. Most of the order deals with lessening the suffering of others and succoring the sick, performing last rites, and consoling those who have been touched by tragedy. I belong to a suborder, known as the Dramatic Order of Knights of Khorasan. We were the lighter side of Pythian life, if you will. We like to remind people that there's more to life than death. Born in Finland in the late 19th century, I didn't set foot on American soil until 1903. I had traveled halfway across the world spreading the words of peace and brotherly love, and I intended to do the same to this savage country. A woodsman by trade, I traveled all over until I landed here, finding the motherland of all trees in 1907. The mighty redwood was bigger back then, and there were more of them. Well, once I've found a place to settle, I did a little saving so I could go back home and collect up my sweetheart. Ida was her name, and we grew up as friends and neighbors and often talked about having a family. So in 1912, directly after arriving here in America, we had our first child, Helen. Her brother Howard came the very next year, and little Harvey just a few years after that. Well, it was about this time that America entered the Great War, and like any true-blooded American between the ages of 18 and 45, I enlisted in the draft. And although I was not called to fight, I did my part by applying my trade at the Rolfe shipyards. Well, once the war was over and there was no more work at the shipyards, even the town of Rolfe dried up. And Rolfe, the mayor of San Francisco, decided to sell it. It once again became the town of Fairhaven, which led me to Scotia to become a millwright, and Ida took the family back to the home country to meet their grandparents, which they couldn't do during the war. Well, shortly after their return to America, we had our fourth child, little Hazel. She was a sickly thing and had always had a bad stomach, and she only lasted 5 years, so we brought her here to the family plot and buried her. Unbeknownst to us, I would be joining her just 2 short years later. By this time, I was a woods carpenter for the Pacific Lumber Company. I had been a California resident for over 22 years. I had a lovely wife and smart, healthy children. I worked with some of the greatest men under the greatest canopy of trees in the world. I couldn't have been happier. It was an early fall Saturday and lunch was upon us. And like every day, we climbed onto the flat train car, headed back to Camp Grant, where they always put on a fine spread. Well, by we, I mean me and 6 other men. No more than boys, really. Some of them were going to school with my children. Well, we were riding along, laughing and joking as we always did, until an unexpected lurch in the train car cut our laughter short. A pile of coiled cable had popped an end loose, and we watched horrified as that end of cable got caught in the wheels and started getting sucked under the train at an alarming speed. Poor Bob Arthur had been sitting on that coil of cable, and we couldn't even breathe before he was snagged and sucked under the train to his death. Well, coils of cable started whipping around the car, and we all jumped back. Unfortunately for Dave Adams, he was caught and couldn't escape. I didn't have any time to think, so I just ran over and shoved him out of the way as soon as I could. At the very last second even, and well, I got snagged in his place, and well, mercifully, it was quick, and no one else followed me into this tragedy. Well, like I said, I'd led a long, good life, and my wife and children went on to lead long and happy, productive lives themselves. And Mr. Adams, the man I saved that day, well, he had a fiancée at home, and they had 4 wonderful children of their own, children who might not have been born if I hadn't been there that day to help him. Life happens fast, so be kind to one another. My name was Gus Stone, and this is my story.
Hello there, I'm Ed Baldry. Well, Nathan Edward Baldry is my given name, but I prefer Ed. You see, my dad's name is Nathan, and as a child, I hated being called Little Nathan. My dad, Nathan David Baldry, he was a bootmaker of Mayfair and Bloomsbury. Well, I grew up in London, right around the British Museum. It was built 7 years before I was born. It was a time of great construction and expansion and enthusiasm in London. And, well, the year before I was born, the Metropolitan Railway opened. That's the first of London's undergrounds. Well, you see a lot of children playing with blocks. You don't see a lot of children making boots. And I had no interest in becoming a bootmaker, but, that's what I would have been had I stuck around. But my granddad, my mom's dad, he was a builder, and so was my uncle, my mom's brother, who went out to Australia. And it just seemed to me that that would be the thing to do. And so when I was 16, I came to this country with the idea of, yep, I'm going to get into building, and I worked my way across the country, honing my skills in my chosen profession. Got to San Francisco in 1887. Well, didn't take me very long to fall in love with that marvelous building wood, redwood, and I had to see where it came from and how it was milled. And so I came up here to Humboldt County and worked in the mills. Humboldt County was good to me. Here I met Emma Lockwood. We were married in 1889. It was also here in Humboldt that I became an American citizen. Well, Emma and I had good work down in San Francisco, and she had people up here, so we went back and forth between Humboldt and the city, but eventually we put down roots here. In 1895, our daughter was born, Florence, named for my older sister. Well, life was good. And then in 1898, Emma died. It took me a long time to get over that. But as they say, time heals all ills. And in 1907, I married Julia. Julia Whitehead, the love of the rest of my life. We lived at 1928 Main Street, or C Street sometimes. You know, they kept changing them. We had 5 wonderful children who attended Fortuna High School. I was proud of them, and I was proud of that school because I built most of it. I built most of the elementary school over in Ferndale and the Catholic Church in Lolita. life was again good. And then one day, it was a Wednesday, the 13th of July. I was out on a construction site. I stepped on a nail. Didn't think much of it. In 45 years of construction, you step on nails. I gave myself some first aid, went back to work, but by Sunday my muscles were failing. My son James, he brought Dr. Rockwell in, and Rockwell takes one look at me and says, "My God, man, you've got lockjaw." So they rushed me off to the hospital in Scotia. But it was too late. I was dead within hours. When the Lord summons you, you can't say no. But I'm still a little irritated. You see, that wasn't a rusty nail. It was brand new. Thank you.